think the Starmer leadership has been defined by a kind of caution, which is quite interesting because when you think back to the leadership election in 2020, Starmer presented himself as continuity Corbyn, that he was really just going to be carrying on the policies of Corbyn, the radical policies of Corbyn, but with a better way of presenting them. And of course, really almost as soon as he got those votes from the Labour members to become leader, he's really abandoned that outlook. In many ways, concern one might have about the Starmer leadership is that he's operating under a kind of orthodoxy about political strategy that was accurate for the context of the 1990s, when Labour was indeed 20 points ahead in the polls. Tony Blair inherited a Labour Party from John Smith that had a double-digit poll lead. And the economic conditions of the 1990s were very different as well. This was a time of growing prosperity, certainly as the decade wore on. One thing that I note is that when Blair was elected, it was only 15 years since the winter of discontent, which is about the same time as between now and the financial crisis. So I think Starmer has been advised by people who perhaps think, well, the way that Labour wins is by repeating the kind of caution that defined the Blair leadership in the lead up to 1997. But I'm afraid that the political and economic context for today is so different that I don't think that's a winning strategy.
Easy to be cautious when you're already very far ahead in the polls, but if you're trying to get to that lead in the first place, you might need to make a bit more of a splash. I wonder, though, in what direction should that splash be made? Gordon Brown, of course, calling for temporary nationalisation this week. But the Labour Party seems to be steering away from that. Indeed, the strategy of the Labour Party has been to veer away from the dangers that might bring electorally, promising things that couldn't be funded or indeed that people remember of less than fondly. What else could the Labour Party be doing? Or would it be simply enough for them to say something, whatever it is?
Part of the problem is that the Labour Party hasn't really looked at why it lost recent elections. There's a group in the Labour Party that think that Labour lost the 2019 election because it had a radical manifesto. There's a group that say that actually the kind of economic policies weren't to blame. It was Labour's approach on Brexit and support for a second referendum. Personally, I think there's more evidence that it's the latter than the former. Indeed, the 2017 manifesto, although Labour, of course, still lost that election, it saw the biggest swing to Labour in one election, 10 points. Labour's lead went up 10 points between 2015 and 2017. So part of it is a problem where I think there's the people around Starmer want to say that actually the reason that Labour lost was because of the economic programme of the Corbyn years. But it might well be that actually it was the very Brexit policy that Keir Starmer himself had piloted as shadow Brexit secretary in those years, which is something a bit uncomfortable and awkward for Labour people to admit. And I think this goes to the heart of the problem with Starmer leadership, is that there is a breach of trust. There's been two breaches of trust, I think, with Starmer leadership. One is with Leave voters, where Labour went into 2017 saying it would respect the referendum, and then Starmer used his period as shadow Brexit secretary to do everything to jettison that pledge. And then there's been another breach of trust with Labour members, where Starmer pledged to be continuity Corbyn on policy, and he hasn't been. And, for a person who has made the whole case for his leadership that he's someone who can be trusted, in contrast to Boris Johnson, the Conservative parties, this seems like a slightly odd strategy to be taking.